evening. Welcome to Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I'm Holly Smith. I coordinate the business and policy programs here. I'm so pleased to welcome you tonight to tonight's discussion on the new geopolitics of Asia and the upcoming G-20 summit. And I'm especially pleased because tonight is the first program we have with our scholar-in-residence, Professor Alejandro Reyes. Professor Reyes is a familiar face to those of you who frequent our programs. He has a long and distinguished career as a journalist, an academic, an educator, and as a senior advisor to Canada's Foreign Ministry. And we're very lucky that he's sharing his expertise and experience with us here at Asia Society. This is the first in a series of programs we hope he'll do on geopolitics and geoeconomics, and more will be announced soon. I also want to mention that we have two other scholars in residence this year. One is Professor Christine Loh, and the other is Professor Tschang. Professor Loh has a program next week on decarbonization efforts in China, so please check it out if you're available. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Reyes to introduce the panel.
Thanks. Right. Good evening. It's been quite some time since I've done something like this, so it'll be interesting. A special welcome, if I might, to the Asia Global Fellows, I believe, who are here from the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. You mind if you just raise your hands, just that folks will know? Yeah, so thank you very much for coming. We have these wonderful fellows from around the world who are here. They've just arrived, and they're going to be here for about 3 months till November. So welcome. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much, Holly, for the introduction, and also thank you to the Asia Society Hong Kong Center, Alice, Meng, Kelvin, and colleagues who are here. We've been preparing for this event for some time. So it's fantastic for me to finally, the day has arrived, although kind of the tension is building because of the typhoon. As it is my debut, as it were, I meant to make some remarks about geopolitics. So for your forbearance, before we get into the discussion, I'll just say a few things. I thought it was supposed to be in the vein of an inaugural address. So I thought, well, am I supposed to say something like, ask not what the special administrative region can or cannot do for you, ask what you can do for the special administrative region. I have thoughts on that, but not for tonight, right? So instead, we thought we would cast this evening's discussion as a G20 curtain raiser. It's convenient. G20 will start on September 9 in Delhi, and talk about the new geopolitics. Now, many of you might have been here when my colleague Tschang spoke the other week. So maybe you're geopoliticized out by now. So I thought I would try to make this a little bit more personal. Even though even as we speak, a lot of US-China developments, the geopolitics are going on. Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary of the United States, in fact, has been in Beijing, and a Canadian minister, our environment minister, when I use our, I sometimes refer to Canada, sometimes I refer to Hong Kong, sometimes I refer to the Philippines. You'll have to forgive me. But our Canadian environment minister is in Beijing right now. The first visit by a Canadian cabinet minister in 4 years. So, but think about that in the context of the two Michaels, Meng Wanzhou case. Anyway, so I'm putting my practitioner's hat on for this evening, right? And I'm trying to think about what is geopolitics, right? So politics, and there is some kind of geographical, regional aspect to it. Nowadays, we hear a lot of people saying, ooh, it's about geopolitics, all about geopolitics now. It used to be economics, it used to be trade and investment, but now we have to talk about geopolitics. A lot of companies are now hiring geopolitics risk analysts and such. And I've even heard people come to me to say, when you're publishing, and I've been publishing a journal called the Asia Global Online, they said, you really should stay away from too much geopolitics. Focus more on the economics. Focus more on the trade. And I've even heard a senior businessman here advise me that, or tell me that he would prefer to stay away from geopolitics because it's too difficult, particularly in the environment in which we're living here in Hong Kong today. I think that's kind of wishful thinking. I think we can always have serious talks about geopolitics, and there's really no separating the politics and the economics today. I mean, we're in a real kind of, it's the geopolitics stupid moment, I suppose, but I think we have to remember that geopolitics is not anything terribly new. It's been around. Everything old is new again. I mean, if you just consider the discussions we've been having about the so-called Thucydides trap, right? We're then making reference to a geopolitical concept that's been around since the 5 BCE, right, during the Peloponnesian Wars. So now let me get. Oh, there we go. So because today is my debut, it's D-Day for me as scholar-in-residence, I kept on thinking, well, how do I talk about geopolitics and think about what it means to understand today in a complete sense? What is complete geographic, a geopolitical scientist approach? And I kept on coming up with Ds. It's probably more economical to just have 3 points, but every time I kept on adding Ds, it became a kind of a obsession that these are all the Ds that I could come up with that I'm going to deal with very quickly, right? So, there we go. So, as I say, almost everything old is new again, right? And I think this is an interesting thing, like, for us to think about. I was going to talk mainly, I thought that we all know about the US-China rivalry. I'm going to try to avoid this. We'll have a lot of discussion about it in the panel. But I was also going to, I was thinking about talking about multipolarity. These are sort of schemas that will that show you sort of what multipolarity might look like visually, but I think I'm also going to stay away from this, right? What I'm going to talk about, first D, is this idea that domestic politics informs foreign policy making. This is not new. This is something when I was in school in 1984, I studied under Bob Putnam at Harvard University, where he came up with something called the two-level game. And this is the schema. The idea that domestic actors interact with the government, and the government works on both the domestic level as well as the international level. And there is some dynamic, two-level game occurring. Right? To me, in 1984, this was a revelation, especially since we had a scenario role-playing game where maybe it was not politically correct then, but it was, I guess, acceptable. I played the role of the Japanese prime minister since I was the only Asian in the class. And so I shuttled during that role-playing exercise. I shuttled from being at the table with the other G7 actors to the Japan room where I discussed what our position should be with the business leader, the representative of Keidanren, and farmers. And when we talk about today, geopolitics, we cannot possibly understand the dynamics going on at the international level without understanding what's happening domestically in each of the countries. And I think this is an important principle that we have to always think about. So as a geopolitical analyst, I think it's important to understand the domestic politics as well as how that interplays with the foreign policy. Second, drama, which is the word I put for basically as a proxy for the word emotion. This book really affected me when it came out in 2008. Dominique Moisy is a French political scientist who spoke for the first time about how geopolitics, there is such a thing as a geopolitics of emotion, that a lot of the activity, the international relations, how they're conducted, is not necessarily according to interests or driven by interests, but there is an emotional factor involved, that cultures of fear, humiliation, and hope are reshaping the world, as he has in his subtitle. The fear is what he's associated with the geopolitics in the United States. Humiliation is what he associated with the geopolitics of the Middle East. And hope, the geopolitics that he associated in this part of the world, in the Asia Pacific. Now, if you think about how this interplays today, right, if you try to understand that there are emotional aspects to the geopolitics as they play out, then combine that with our social media atmosphere and how emotions can just be projected very quickly, instantaneously, all over the world, and people are empowered in many ways by their ability to express their emotions right out there directly to everybody in the world. This is a factor in influencing how geopolitics, conflicts, disputes play out. And I think this is an important, again, aspect of trying to analyze. You have to understand what are the emotional drivers behind a lot of the foreign policy acting, the performative aspect of it, largely because we have this emotional, this cultural emotions driving some geopolitical thinking, and you combine it with the hyper connectivity of social media. As I say, I recommend this book highly, even though it's been around for some time. The next bit, disruption. Now, I don't know if anybody knows Dennis Simon, who's a long-time activist or researcher in, I consider him an activist, a researcher in innovation and technology studies, right? I put him here because if we talk about disruptions today on the geopolitical landscape, technology, I think, is one of the most important that we have to kind of understand. It's not possible today to understand the geopolitical landscape, the dynamics internationally, without understanding the technological aspects. Now, I met Dennis Simon in 1995 when I was doing some research at NYU, and he was working on understanding the Chinese indigenous innovation system, right? Back in 1995, where there are discussions about, can China even innovate given its political system, right? How would China be able to develop its own innovation, domestic indigenous innovation ecosystem? There were rather a lot of doubts at that time, because the story, as it were, the narrative about China was that, oh, they can't innovate. It's a authoritarian system. It's impossible for people to do research and development as we know it in the West, right? And there was, if they're going to become a technological power or develop their own indigenous innovation system, it'll be only because they steal the technology from the West. But at this time, again, 1995, you saw the beginnings of what we know now as a more formidable indigenous innovation system, albeit within that authoritarian system. This is 1995, the brand new IBM R&D facility in Beijing, dating back to 1995, one of the very first that came to China, built by a multinational. So my point here is we have to understand that there are these kinds of disruptions on the way that we may not recognize, that we may dismiss. And in 1995, the general consensus was to say China is not going to develop that indigenous innovation system. Dennis Simon was one of those who said it's going to happen. And just as a footnote, he recently resigned from his position at UNC Chapel Hill because he's been protesting in protest of the negative perception of university authorities on cooperation with China, that he's taken a stand because Dennis has been a significant player in the US-China science and technology cooperation, which of course, as we know, there's an agreement that's in jeopardy at the moment, whether it will be renewed. And Dennis has taken a stand because he feels that the university where he's at, UNC, is not open to exchange with China. Sorry, I really have to keep moving. Okay, so disruptions, I know what's happening here. There we go. Disruptions create danger, and I just put these here because essentially what we have now, fast forward from 1995, is essentially the weaponization of everything, everywhere, all at once, right? We have money, trade, microchips. This is Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter signing that US science and technology agreement in 1979 that's now in jeopardy. So many things have turned from disruption to the perceived danger, that is, perceived risk, the perceived threat, and now we have this entrenched rivalry between the two superpowers. Fareed Zakaria made an argument that it's not about America's decline, it's but the rest are catching up. And I think that that's generally true. In particular, China was catching up to the United States in areas such as technology and trade, and maybe less so in terms of use of currency. And that has created a sense of insecurity in the United States that, frankly, has fueled the rivalry. Now, let me move on to determination. In some ways, I'm not calling it a solution, but I think what's important for the countries that get caught kind of in the middle, I'm not talking about middle powers. I'm talking about caught in the middle countries, is agency, the determination to be able to decide their own future, to make the decisions, even though they may have to make choices between what the great powers might want from each of them. I point here to Bharat Jagdeo, who currently, he looks older now. This is Bharat in 2009. He is currently the vice president of Guyana, a small country of right now 800,000 people in South America. At the time I met Bharat, he was the president of Guyana. This is in 2009. I met him in Switzerland, where I saw him at a lunch where he presented on environmental issues. And after the lunch, he was sitting all by himself, and I asked him, well, what does it mean to be a leader of a South American country today in 2009? And his answer was very simple. I have to be aware that the movement for sustainable development means that my raw materials may be in less demand around the world. I have to find new markets for them. So that's China. I have to go to some place where there's money to buy my raw materials. So he had just been to China about a year before then. But then he said, because of the sustainable development movement, I also have to go to talk to countries that will support me in being more socially responsible, environmentally responsible. So he said, from Switzerland, he was going to Norway to discuss with the Norwegians a program for Norway to pay Guyana not to cut trees. And so it's an interesting case study of the kind of agency, the kind of governance that's needed for the times, what Bharat at that time was experiencing. Fast forward to just in July this year, his president, Irfan Ali, Bharat, his vice president, was in China speaking to Xi Jinping, largely because today Guyana is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Guyana in 2015 found considerable petroleum reserves and is now being courted by both the United States and China. If you look at the list of VIP visitors to Guyana in the last year or so, or few years, you'll find that all of a sudden Guyana has been discovered by the great powers and is receiving all sorts of courtship. Same with countries like Papua New Guinea, the Pacific Island countries, that therein lies the challenge of these caught-in-the-middle countries trying to assert their agency. And can they do that? I brought these hinges largely because essentially they're what people are calling pivotal powers, pivotal states. I like to call them kind of hinge powers, hinge states, because they can, they're not necessarily equal. I mean, India might be one of those states that you would that are essentially a hinge state between China and the United States, or between the West and the East. But many countries will be an unequal hinge, where they're connected more to one side or the other, and there will be countries that will swing both ways, as it were. They have a door that opens both ways, right? And this is the challenge, finding that agency. How do countries do that, right? Denial. I think this is an important aspect of the US-China relationship, that a lot of what is driving the US-China dispute, and indeed what is driving the difficulty that many countries have in finding their own agency, are misperceptions, denial of the evidence about themselves and about the other country. Just as an example, I would say that the United States has this, within Washington, there is the belief that China wants to become the global hegemon, to displace the United States. Where is the evidence for that? But that idea fuels a lot of the policy thinking in Washington. In China, there is this idea that the United States is in some kind of perpetual decline, but the data doesn't really support that. But a lot of the actions that you see coming out of Beijing may actually be predicated on that idea that the United States and the West is in free fall decline. Which brings me to data. I think it's important in geopolitical analysis to think about data and what is the true real evidence. I put my old professor, John D. Montgomery, this is about the only picture I could find, largely because John was doing big data analysis before there was big data, before there were computers. He went out to southern Africa, collected thousands and thousands of incidents in a kind of critical incident method to find out truths about corruption in southern Africa. When we worked on some research, he said, we discovered that it's not necessarily true that in a democracy there is less corruption than in a authoritarian state. The thesis was that there would be less corruption in a democracy than there would be in an authoritarian state, but he did a big data analysis that disproved some of those notions. And it's just, I put this here mainly because I think this is one of the things that is often missing in public policy work and in public policy analysis, is looking at the data, right? I need to finish soon, right? Yeah. So I should end. The domestic agenda, I think this is important. I think before a country can perform on the international stage, it's important for a country to get its domestic policies right. And I put this here largely because Shinzo Abe, I think, was a poster leader for that kind of thinking, that he needed to get his domestic agenda right in order to be able to perform well on the stage. And I think leadership has become important. I think now we have too much performative leadership. The kind of leaders that Margaret Thatcher here is talking about don't seem to exist anymore in the social media world. We end up having leaders who are driven just by performance, the need to say things. So it's necessary to cultivate your own garden. I love this, this saying from Candide. And indeed, the last little bit that I would have, and this brings us into the G20, is this idea that what is really important? We focus so much on the US-China tension, whereas I think the G20 is significant in largely because it brings us back to what is truly important, and that's development, particularly sustainability, sustainable development. And at the end of the day, it's about the final D, delivery. Can you deliver results to make people's lives better? We obsess so much over the US-China geopolitics and geopolitics in general, but all of it, what is the most important thing? It's the planet, and we, to our peril, we end up ignoring these imperatives, the imperatives of the environment, of the world, of the planet. Thank you very much. Again, I apologize for having gone way too long, but if I might introduce on stage my colleagues. First of all, we have connected online Ambassador Mohan Kumar. Just a second, let me. So Ambassador Mohan Kumar is Professor of Diplomatic Practice at the Jindal School of International Affairs at OP Jindal Global University in India. He is Dean, Strategic and International Initiatives, and the inaugural director of the Jindal Global Center for G20 Studies at the university. Ambassador Kumar has had an outstanding career in the Indian Foreign Service, lasting 36 years, which culminated in his being India's ambassador to France. And then joining us from the floor, up on stage, is Chi-Jia Tschang. She is a senior director for BowerGroupAsia's Hong Kong office and is responsible for managing, maintaining, and expanding regional client relationships, as well as serving as BGA's Hong Kong market lead and permanent presence. Prior to joining BGA, Chi-Jia worked at Goldman Sachs for nearly 10 years, where she oversaw the company's Asia-Pacific internal crisis management. And before moving to Hong Kong, Chi-Jia worked in the Beijing office of the International Crisis Group. And finally, Zhang Baohui is Professor of Government and International Politics. Please join me on stage. International Politics at Lingnan University. He was also the director of the Center for Asian Pacific Studies from 2010 to 2020. His research interests include great power politics, Chinese foreign policy, Sino-US relations, and nuclear deterrence. His recent publications include Hoping for the Best, Preparing for the Worst, China's Varied Responses to US Strategic Competition in the Journal of Contemporary China, published this year, and When Civilizational Clashes Meet Power Shifts, Rethinking Global Disorder, Chinese Journal, in the Chinese Journal of International Politics last year. He is currently studying the dynamics of great power competition and their implications for the world order. So thank you very much all for joining us, and thank you very much, Ambassador Kumar. If we could start with you, Ambassador. We could start with you, Ambassador. Can you hear us? Hello, Ambassador. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Great. Welcome.
Yes,
Welcome very much. Now, I thought we would just start with the G20 in India. Could you tell us about India's agenda, its significance, what's different about it? Because if you look at certainly the next few years, we had Indonesia in the presidency last year, and Indonesia is a kind of BRICS-y country, even though it's not part of the BRICS. But this year, India, part of the BRICS. Next year, Brazil, part of the BRICS. And the year after, South Africa, part of the BRICS. So in the G20 driver's seat will be the BRICS countries. Tell us a bit about the Indian G20 agenda and how you see it in its significance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Chairman. I want to begin by thanking the Asia Society Hong Kong and Holly Smith for inviting me. It's a great honor and a pleasure. Let me begin by just outlining India's priorities, or at least the way India sees this particular G20. I think we've seen it as a people's presidency, and this goes to your point, Al. If you allow me to call you Al, this goes to the point that you made about domestic politics and the intersection with international politics. I think Prime Minister Modi has chosen to really make this a people's presidency by showcasing different parts of India. So I've met G20 delegates who've been able to go to the far corners of India. I myself haven't traveled too much in India, so they probably know more about my country than I do. But I think that is the first way in which I will put it to you, that this is about showcasing India. Somewhere at a subliminal level, India is also overcompensating for the fact that we don't have a seat at the high table in the UN Security Council. And the fact that the UN has declined, the fact that the UN Security Council has become thoroughly irrelevant in the context of at least Ukraine. So maybe there is this tendency on the part of India to overcompensate a little. I readily concede that, but I think this is a moment that India wants to make its own. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point I want to make is that I think India is making a valiant attempt at being the voice of the global South. I thought this was a master stroke by India to have a virtual summit in January 2023 with 125 countries. And we sought out their priorities and their interest. And I thought this was good on the part of India, because we know that G20 is exclusive. Not everybody is represented in the G20. And therefore, to just get an idea of what the priorities and interests are of the G20, and the priorities and the interests that came out will cause no one any great surprise. The small island economies, for example, talked about the existential interest when it comes to climate change. Countries like Maldives and Seychelles, which probably said they won't exist if the big powers continue to burn the kind of coal that people are burning. So that's one. The second, of course, is the impact of the Ukraine war in terms of food, fuel, and fertilizer. So there was a food security angle, and these countries suffered from food insecurity. Last but not least, I think these countries pushed for, frankly, reformed multilateralism. They just got the feeling their voice wasn't heard. UN Security Council, as I said, kind of emanates from World War II. So in my view, it simply is not representative of contemporary realities, either power or geopolitics, whichever way you look at it. And I thought these countries made a point for reformed multilateralism. In all of this, I concede that India had its own interest as well, because many of the priorities of the global South are actually India's priorities as well. And I will address them presently. Al, do I have 5 more minutes? I don't want to take
just
too
a
much
couple
time.
more minutes,
Can you give me
Ambassador.
5 more minutes?
Yeah, a couple more minutes. Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll get back to you.
And then
We'll
finally,
get back to you.
yeah, sure. No, I don't want to disrupt your program completely. So the last point I
already
make is
did.
that in addition to showcasing India, in addition to being the voice of the global South, I think India is also trying to be the bridge between the North and the South. I'm not sure we have the agency, which I think you mentioned as well, to solve the Ukraine problem. I don't think India has the agency to do it. So in the latest meeting of the ministers that terminated last week, I think we are falling back on exactly the same language as it came out of Bali. So that paragraph was the only paragraph to which Russia and China disagreed, and the rest of the paragraphs go through as an outcome document. That paragraph alone is called the chair's summary. So I will be very surprised if between now and the G20 summit a miracle happens and all the G20 leaders are able to arrive at a consensus on a paragraph on Ukraine. One more minute. I think the SDGs are important, Sustainable Development Goals, and we are going to have a high profile Sustainable Development Goal Summit in the United Nations on 19th and 20th of September. I've just seen the advanced copy of the Global Sustainable Development Report 2023. It makes terrible reading. It says the world is completely off track when it comes to the achievement of sustainable development goals. This is the advanced copy of the SDG report, which will then be available 2 weeks from now. And the UN Secretary General says half the world has been left behind. And the Secretary General goes on to say in the foreword that if the world doesn't pull itself up by its bootstraps, this will be the epitaph of the world as we know it. I don't think it can get worse than that. So SDG goal number 1, no poverty. SDG goal number 2, no hunger. SDG 3, on other things, gender parity and the rest of it, I think we are completely off track. I say that because this is the halfway mark to the SDG. The timeline we have is 2030. We're already 2023. We've got 7 more years.
Ambassador
so
Kumar,
that is something that India may want to highlight as well.
Ambassador Kumar,
I'll stop here. Yeah. I'll stop here and then perhaps have an interaction.
Can I ask you one quick question? You've talked about India wanting to sort of be a champion for the global South. Do you see them in competition with China for that role, or are they complementing each other in terms of becoming a voice for global Asia, global South?
So I certainly don't think they're complementing each other right now. That's something I would be honestly willing to say up front, because China's another. The reason is maybe geopolitics. I don't deny that, but the fact is you have to understand China is $10,000 per capita, and by its own admission, it has abolished extreme poverty. China has not, India has not abolished extreme poverty and is languishing at something like $3,000 per capita. So I would argue with you that China could be considered a nominal member of the global South, but not any more than that. You need to be a really poor, less advanced country to say, I belong to the global South. I don't see how China can do that on any criteria, frankly. I mean, you're talking about a 14 trillion economy. You're talking a per capita income, which is more than $10,000. UN has classified it as a middle income country. So I know China would like to say that, and the BRICS expansion is something we can talk about as well. But I would really say in that sense that there is no complementarity. There is probably some geopolitical competition there.
Thank you very much. Baohui, I'm wondering if you could pick up from that. One issue is, the G20 in 2009, in the throes of the global financial crisis, really took over from the G7 as the main forum for managing the global economy. And by most accounts, it did well at that time to bring people together. But since then, there have been frictions that have not necessarily kept the G20 as cohesive as it was then. So do you see the G20 as continuing to be a useful mechanism for international politics?
Well, I think you mentioned the most spectacular moment of the G20, right? In 2008, 2009. They took very effective collective actions, and then they saved the world economy. It's simply because of the G20, the financial crisis was overcome very quickly. And so at that moment, some people even said, why do we need the UN? G20 has become or emerge as the preeminent global governance body that can take actions, can make a difference. But unfortunately, that was the end of the so-called, I would say, the golden era of international politics, which was also the unipolar era, because that era, international politics speaking, was defined by cooperation, by interdependence, by ultimately global governance. But soon after that, geopolitics returned. We entered a new mode of international relations. So by 2018, 2017, we officially entered the new era of great power competition. And great power competition means, of course, competition and conflict. G20 means cooperation. So global governance is out. Great power rivalry is in and will stay with us forever. I shouldn't say forever, but for the next 20 years. So in that process, G20, as well as other bodies of global governance, as the ambassador said, the UN, they have all faded. Also, don't forget WTO. Right. Who still remembers WTO, right? 20 years ago, WTO was ruling the world.
I was just in communication with them.
I know the IMF, the World Bank, but now who even talk about those multilateral institutions? G20 is only part of that. They have all faded. But that is a problem because, as you said correctly, as also Ambassador said, we cannot forget development-oriented international agendas, right? Because we still have a lot of people. We still have the climate change issue, living in abject poverty. We have the climate change issues. All those need countries to unite and work together. But the leading powers now are obsessed with rivalry with each other. They no longer care about global governance. They no longer care about collective efforts to promote development, climate, environmental protection. So those issues have taken the back seat, unfortunately.
One point in reaction, the WTO recently had a development investment agreement, which nobody has heard about, right? I don't think anybody's heard about. But this
because
is quite
it's faded.
Yeah, it's faded. But it is
News,
quite interesting because for the first time it has a mechanism that is not meant to be about unanimity, but those that can agree. I mean, just a small aside, because I'm a kind of defender of WTO, but I'm probably the only one in the room.
No, I like WTO to be effective. But great power rivalry has rendered WTO ineffective. That's the unfortunate.
But let me ask you this.
Yes.
Despite the great power rivalry that you say has kind of undermined the global governance structures as we know them, and yet the United States and China have been busy trying to create lattice work, as they call it, lattice work of regional, plurilateral, even trilateral, we just saw from Japan, South Korea, the United States, arrangements. Is that not a kind of attempt to have some kind of global governance, albeit in a way that is much more geopolitically motivated, certainly in the part of the United States with the Quad and others? Right?
Yeah, you are right. I think that's part of the problem that threatens global governance. The U.S. is moving towards so-called minilateralism, which means arrangements with friends and allies, but excludes strategic rivals. And so that is I would say, any institutions created out of that motive, they are competitors of truly multilateral global governance institutions. And then we can mention another phenomenon, that is the great powers, including Japan, India, they are creating separate, competing regional orders that are competitors of each other. So Japan, of course, took over from the TPP and created its successor organization, and then China worked with ASEAN to create RCEP, and of course India refused to join. India would prefer something else. So basically today, even regional level multilateral arrangements reflect dynamics of great power conflict and competition. They each try to create and influence their own institutions, and those institutions often exclude their rivals.
Now, is that a bad thing?
I think it's a bad thing. I think it reflects the so-called zero-sum game mindset among the great powers. So if you have a regional organization, say the TPP, I need to create another one. A Chinese scholar named He Kai, now teaches in Australia, he invented a good theory called institutional balancing. He said this is the way to compete. Yeah, you run a organization, I create another one to compete.
Anything
with
you can do, I can do better.
Exactly. It's a competition, not cooperation. So the overall dynamics is not good. It is, all of those signify rising competition among the great powers, not cooperation. But the world needs great powers to unite and work for the common themes that affect
Recording in
mankind.
progress.
Interesting.
Oh,
I hope not by a spy
I think that's
agency or
Big Brother.
something,
That's Big Brother,
Big Brother,
telling us that the recording is now in progress. Thank you very much. Baohui, Chi-Jia, I'm wondering, in all of this, a word that was roiling around in the geopolitical discussion was decoupling, that we were in some kind of decoupling environment. And then some folks, I think particularly in Europe, decided that they wanted to be a little bit more polite about it. And they've come up with the word de-risking. Now, from your perspective, given all the geopolitical jumble and this idea of de-risking and your interaction with corporates in the region, what is de-risking, and what are the companies that you communicate with? How do they see it? How are they trying to navigate this de-risking, decoupling environment?
I think that more than anything, companies are looking for an environment of certainty for their investments. They're having to make adjustments over these few years as political, geopolitical, and regulatory issues impact operations and business decisions. And a big challenge for them is risk management, right? And how to navigate this new environment, particularly when their business touches on like some of the sensitive areas that China and the US are in competition over now. So like semiconductors, space technology, artificial intelligence. But I think from a corporate perspective, the de-risking, if we're going to call it that, which is a much nicer way of saying decoupling, I don't think there's a huge difference. I think it actually started years ago, so like 4 or 5 years ago. And back then it was called like rebalancing or diversification.
Resilience, right?
Yeah, greater resiliency. So, and back then it was primarily being driven by pressures from the Chinese domestic environment, I would say, the political and regulatory environment. So about 3 or 4 years ago, when the Chinese government started intensifying kind of the fintech and technology crackdown, they announced new privacy laws. They modified regulations for cross-border data transfers. There were new measures impacting the gaming industry in a big way, and then there was also the crackdown on private sector education. So there were a lot of regulatory changes. So that really impacted the big tech companies, the big conglomerates in China like Alibaba and Meituan and Didi. So, I think investors who were heavily into the China market then saw this happening and thought, well, we need to diversify, we need to rebalance our investments so it's not so weighted heavily on China. So we've seen, and then this was accelerated throughout the COVID lockdowns for sure because of supply chain and labor shortages, issues like that. So I think that we've seen a lot of companies, definitely a lot more interest in India, a lot of interest in Southeast Asia. So Vietnam is what we've seen as the top ASEAN or Southeast Asia market that companies look to, followed by Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. I think that looking into the future, though, companies are going to they'll need to figure out how to de-risk from China, not just because of the China-US rivalry, but also because that there's going to be increased external pressures on them. Coming from the US and other EU, I think, and EU companies, like the recent Biden executive order restricting outbound investments in certain industries. And investment companies tend to be very conservative, very cautious. So I think that they're probably likely to stay away from from investments beyond what is actually restricted from the executive order. And I know the Treasury Department needs to take some time to go through exactly what the regulations and measures are going to actually look like. So it'll probably be another year before those come out. But I think that companies in general will stay away from investing in any Chinese company in certain sectors, and we've seen some of the fallout of this happen already. Like if you'd seen Sequoia Capital, the venture capital firm, in June they announced that they're going to split into 3 independent firms. So one arm is going to only do China investments, another one will be focused on India and Southeast Asia, and then the third company that's being spun off will focus on the U.S. And then we've also seen like global law firms say that they're going to break apart their China business so that the China business is only going to do China, and then the rest of the globe will be its own separate law firm. And yeah, so I think companies like more and more are just figuring out how they're going to structure themselves and the impact of all these changes.
Because we're in Hong Kong, and I don't want to throw you for a loop, but what about how does Hong Kong figure in terms of the whole de-risking atmosphere?
I think that's an interesting one because a lot of companies are still very keen to be in Hong Kong because it's still seen as a international financial center, and if not that, then definitely the gateway for mainland China, where a lot of people still have interests in. But I think Hong Kong, there's been a lot, I think, written over about the Hong Kong-Singapore competition, and it's interesting that if you look at it from even Chinese companies that have more and more established international headquarters in Singapore, we've seen a lot of that. It's like Hong Kong isn't far enough away from China for them. Like even ByteDance, TikTok isn't in Hong Kong. After the passage of the national security law, like TikTok won't even, isn't even offered here. So I think Chinese companies have taken the opportunity to base their international headquarters in Singapore. I mean, there's different reasons to that. I mean, it's part of it is that Hong Kong is still too close to China. But the other reason is that, they want to be seen as good corporate citizens and kind of have a greater distance, I think, physical and all of that from mainland China to be seen as a global player versus a Chinese player.
And I don't mean to be flippant, but what about, because in my view, the whole idea of de-risking, whether it's something as simple as concentration risk, in other words, you want to be able to have access to PPEs or masks at critical times or things like that. But diversification of your sourcing, diversification of your supply chain just makes sense for everybody, regardless of China. I don't mean to be flippant, but is there any thought about de-risking with regard to the United States, given the political situation there? Is that something that comes up at all?
You mean for companies to de-risk from the U.S.?
Well, I don't know.
I mean, I
just
think
because in my mind there are quite a lot of risks if you look just on the horizon that are political in the United States. Is this an issue? Should it be?
That hasn't really come up with among the companies we've. I mean, everyone always talks about U.S. politics, though, and then we know that from speaking with not just Western companies, but also other companies and other government officials, everyone's worried about a Trump return. Like that's like the thing, like stresses a lot of
If it
governments
does return, then some companies may try to de-risk.
from the
There is a-
U.S.
There's a possibility of that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that everyone looks at U.S. politics, and there is a concern, of course, that if a non-Biden presidency comes in the next term, that they'll undo a lot of what has happened during this term, and I think that Biden has done a really good job, if you want to look at it that way, of shoring up alliances and making allies feel valued in the region. Like there's so much happening around the region, like with Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Biden's like making, I think, the decision to go to Vietnam that was just announced right in the mid-September. I mean, he's doing a great job of like making U.S. allies feel valued.
Although some folks are noting that he's not going to go to ASEAN.
But what is ASEAN going to give him? Because a lot of ASEAN prefers to stay neutral, right? So, I mean, they're
Or
sending
maybe
Kamala
he
Harris. She's
saw
like a,
Vietnam as a pivotal state.
yeah, exactly.
Well,
yeah.
Baohui, do you have any thoughts in terms of Biden skipping ASEAN summit but sending Kamala Harris instead?
No, as I said, maybe they saw some real strategic, attach some strategic importance to Vietnam. They think it is more likely maybe to flip Vietnam because Vietnam does have territorial conflict with China, and many other ASEAN countries. They have said explicitly they don't want to choose, right? For example, Malaysia, Singapore, not to mention that Indonesia. So U.S. of course values its a diplomatic capital. They invested in the right places. So that could be one explanation. That why he skips the bigger meeting but focuses on a specific country, because that country may actually make a difference.
Indeed, if you look at the ASEAN 10, it does seem that Vietnam and the Philippines are the key, I would say, the key hinge countries, the key pivotal
And the
states.
Philippines has already kind of flipped.
They have sort
Yeah,
of flipped.
sort of,
right,
yes,
yeah.
because of the same issues, direct territorial conflict
right.
with China. And so maybe the Americans feel emboldened, we can pursue the next target,
Right. Ambassador, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what you've already mentioned, this idea of India's global role. I think in recent months, of course, people always mention that China and India have had this contentious relationship, the border clashes and such. And of course, India has now gone all in on the Quad construct, which is seen in China as being a kind of containment mechanism. And then India has charted a path in terms of its relations with Russia that has not really pleased the United States that much. And yet, Prime Minister Modi was feted in Washington on a state visit. How should we understand this kind of balancing that India is doing, and the kind of global role it's carving for itself?
Thank you. So I see India as an ultimate practitioner of what I have chosen to call in a forthcoming book, multi-alignment, a practice of multi-alignment, if you like, engage with everybody and try and see where you can prosecute your interests. I think we have a dual challenge, Mr. Chairman. One, we have to get our internal act together. I don't think $3 trillion GDP cuts it for a population of 1.4 billion. I tend to think it's pathetic, frankly. I'm out of government, so I tend to speak more frankly now than I would have done 10 years ago. So I'm also overcompensating in a way. 3 trillion doesn't do India justice. So unless we get to 10 trillion and we have a per capita income approaching at least 6 or 7,000, if not 10,000, like China, I don't think we will have the agency. The second point I want to make, with due respect again, and I'm speaking frankly, I speak under correction. I'm not saying I'm right, but it's my duty to convey this perception since I've been asked to speak. It's hard for me to understand why China chose to do what it did at our border, because frankly, it has pushed us very, very close to the United States. We don't have agency vis-a-vis China because China is at least 4 to 5 times in terms of every conceivable index. You take GDP, you take per capita GDP, you take infant mortality, poverty, whatever index, China is no match for India. It's 5 times bigger, better. So we have left with no choice but to do what international relations scholars will tell you external balancing. That's the only way we can cope with China, frankly. And that's what we are doing. So it's not clear to me why this happened, but that's not important. I think when it comes to India's relations with the United States, now I think we have decided to throw in our lot with the West. All our free trade agreements were to the East 10 years ago. All our impending free trade agreements are to the West. UK, European Union, UAE, Australia. Australia is not to the west of India, but nominally Australia belongs to the West as well. So, frankly, that's an important change that has happened. And I would argue, sitting in India, and again, I speak under correction, I think we've been pushed into doing this. Those of us who belong to the old school of diplomacy, where we believe in strategic hedging, where Prime Minister Manmohan Singh used to say, there is space in Asia for both China and India. It doesn't have to be this way, but it has gotten this way, and I leave it to scholars to figure out why it has happened. Last, a word on India's relationship with Russia. It's a complicated one. I would like to begin by saying we agree with the Western point of view that it is an invasion. It's a violation of the UN Charter. It is a violation of international law. Where we disagree with the West, and perhaps India and China have a point there, is to say that this was not unprovoked aggression. This was provoked by the West. That is where we disagree with the Western characterization. And I point to John Mearsheimer and his colleagues, who I think have made a very good job of arguing. But that doesn't change what Russia did. We have not been able to name and shame Russia, and this is an open secret, because of legacy dependency on defense platforms that India has. So we have a huge legacy dependency. It cannot be reduced overnight. So we have a blossoming defense relationship with France, where I was ambassador. We have a relationship with Israel, which is growing. We have a relationship with the United States, which is growing. But even there, you will find that Prime Minister Modi's trip to Washington was soon followed by his trip to Paris. So even there, we are trying not to put all our defense eggs in one basket, if you know what I mean. So that is where India is. It's practicing multi-alignment to the best of our ability. We are not a great power. We are a middle power. You called it a hinge state. I call it a swing state. Thank you.
By the way, I'm wondering, do you think it is possible to have a multi-aligned kind of positioning outcome? Is that even possible today?
I think it is possible. For it depends on what kind of countries are trying to do that. Most countries not severely dependent on either China, say for economics, or the U.S. for security, they have the luxury. They can refuse to choose. They are essentially practicing non-alignment. The other type of countries that can achieve this includes India. These are the great powers. I think the ambassador is too modest. He says India is a middle power. I think India at least belongs to the rank of a major power, maybe not yet a great power. But anyway, those countries include also, say, France, Germany. They are powerful enough to maintain their own strategic choices. They don't have to choose. Like Macron said, very hot, right? We shouldn't get involved in the Taiwan Strait. We have no business in Sino-US rivalry. We must maintain autonomy. Germany said the same thing. India, in essence, tried to do the same by pursuing multi-alignment, because these countries have that option because they are powerful. Though there's a very small group of countries don't have that option. These are the countries that are heavily dependent on the U.S. for security protection. For example, South Korea, even the Philippines, Japan. And so when they have to choose, they choose. They choose to side with the U.S. So the Semiconductor Alliance is an example of that. These members are all heavily dependent on the U.S. for security protection. But other countries, I think they can. This is the agency issue you mentioned. They can stay by smart diplomacy out of this China-U.S. strategic competition. I think they can do it. At least they want to do it.
Just to promote my own analogy, they have to swing one way on the hinge, right? I mean, sort of. I think you're skeptical, Baohui.
No, I think in most countries, especially of course countries like India, they have that luxury. Most other countries, not deeply affected by either the U.S. or China, they can still stay in the middle. But those who are heavily dependent, Cambodia is the other case, heavily dependent on China economically. So they have also kind of chosen to side with China. Yeah. So those countries, they don't have that option to stay in the middle.
So ironically, you may have a big country that's a middle power, but may have less agency in a way, because Canada, I think, is one example where, because it's connected right at the hip with the United States, its ability to have agency, to have that strategic autonomy, it may be limited.
I think the reason I would, you have a very good point, I think, but I would offer different explanation, and that is great powers, unfortunately, are shaped by the fundamental logics of international politics. They are natural competitors with each other. And therefore, they are trapped in Mearsheimer's so-called tragedy of great power politics. That means they don't have options. They don't have agency because their national interests, their grand strategies are shaped by the international system. They cannot choose not to compete. And of course, countries, I would say, for example, France, Germany, are they still great powers? Many say they are not, but they are major powers. Maybe they are not trying to compete for global leadership. They don't hope, they don't think they have a chance to claim global leadership. But any country that are in a position to claim regional hegemonic positions or even can make a bid for global leadership, they are affected by that great power competition logic. Therefore, they don't have agency. And therefore, in one of your emails, you said, U.S., China, the leaders are talking to each other. Will that make any difference? Is it whether leaders' choices can turn the corner? No, they can't, because their fate is sealed. They are destined as rivals. They don't have agency issue, as you said.
Chi-Jia, I'm wondering whether you could chime in on the U.S.-China relationship from your perspective. Given that we've now seen yet another cabinet minister, cabinet secretary in China, and Raimondo seemed to be trying very hard to maybe accentuate that Biden mechanism of, you're going to cooperate, you're going to compete, you're going to confront, I think is the three C's, as it were, 3 lanes in U.S.-China relations. How do you see it developing in terms of addressing this issue of what are the risks right now in the U.S.-China relationship?
I think that the relationship is going to be rocky. I don't think there's going to be improvements that we could see in the relationship just from some high-level visits. I think that the doubts that have crept into the relationship are very much bipartisan in D.C., that there's a lot of, this is an issue. The China issue is something that seems to unite both parties in D.C., which is pretty rare for them to agree on anything. So, and I think China is probably looking to improve relations because their economy has, I think if you all read the news and follow the media, it's in a really bad spot right now, and they're trying to offer incentives and encourage companies to invest more in China, which, it really fell off a cliff. I think this year, investments into China, the first half of the year, they're trying to entice companies back, as it were, but there's so many doubts, I think, from companies that have been in China and then, needed to, as you say, de-risk or diversify away or look for other markets and supply chains. And then there's also the issue of people being hesitant in a way to travel to China. We had heard that a lot of fund managers just don't want to go there. The risk of executive detainments for any reason, and then there's the new law that was the anti-espionage law, which was actually, I guess, broadened, effective as of July this year. So just people are scared to go. Some people, I won't say everyone, but I mean, people are hesitant. So I think that's something that's just going to trouble the relationship and business people for a while.
Thank you. I'm reminded that we should get into Q&A. And so please, out to the audience, any questions? So gentlemen here, yeah. Please identify yourself if you can, please, and your institution.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Gordon. I'm a writer with Fortune, but don't worry, I'm not wearing the press hat today. I had a question about kind of all the other countries that aren't powers. I mean, there was this debate during the Cold War. Do these countries have greater agency in trying to play the two blocks against each other, or were they stuck in one block or the other? And are we returning to that kind of world where smaller countries, are they locked into this U.S.-China conflict, or perhaps do they have more space to play both sides off against the other and get benefits from both, fooling Beijing to invest in one place because Washington is playing nice, or vice versa?
Baohui, would you like to take that one?
I think it's an excellent question. I think many countries, middle powers, small powers, they are not completely constrained by great power competition. As you said, it may actually create opportunities for them to play one against the other, to extract concession resources from both. And actually, there have been some studies about that issue. Small countries' active management of their strategic environment during the Cold War. For example, Finland did well, prospered, sandwiched between the two superpower, the two camps. It actually thrived. There are many other cases. Singapore has always been doing very well. So it's to some degree agency matters. That means whether a small country can have outstanding leadership that can pursue the so-called best diplomacy, to maximize their influence relative to their so-called power. There's a possibility here, but one category of countries may not have the options, as I said before. Either they are too dependent on the U.S. for security, or they are too dependent on China for economics. They are constrained. They don't have that luxury. But most other countries do have rooms to wiggle, and they have made many global south, many of them have spoken now. They don't want to choose sides, okay? Therefore, there's now the so-called revival of the non-alignment movement, They want a non-alignment too. We don't want to be on either side, because they want to maintain their strategic autonomy, their freedom of actions.
I think it's interesting, the example of Guyana, for example. I mean, a small country of only 800,000, actually, because particularly when the game-changing discovery of oil reserves 8 years ago, suddenly it has more power. It is a hinge state that has greater power because it can play the two sides against each other. Although being in the Caribbean, basically in South America, it's essentially in the U.S. strategic sphere of influence. So there are limits to it. Ambassador, would you like to add to that reply?
Just to agree wholeheartedly with what my co-panelists just said. I think leaving aside a few countries which are terribly indebted, badly governed, and we have a few examples of that, I think most other countries will actually have a lot more margin for maneuver. And if you are smart, you can actually play both countries. So I agree with my co-panelist.
Question out there. Is there someone? Helen, I think, right? Oh, this gentleman behind you, then Helen after, right?
Joe Pan, journalist,
Oh,
but
right.
I'm not going to write on that and anything, but want to make a comment and also pose the questions. Earlier, you mentioned de-risking. You were asking Chi-Jia if there are any companies de-risking from the U.S. So I do want to comment companies like Huawei has been doing that for quite a while, and obviously not enough. At some point, we all learn about it. But there are companies also facing what previously CFIUS has to putting very stringent reviews. So I would love to hear from Chi-Jia on you're in the trenches consulting with different companies. What are the latest with CFIUS that we now hear very little now about companies or Chinese companies? So we'd love to hear more on that.
Chi-Jia?
I haven't been following CFIUS, so I'm going to be totally honest. Because I guess the company I work with, we primarily advise companies looking to invest in Asia. We do have a U.S. presence since that's where our headquarters is, but we don't actually advise companies really looking to enter the U.S. markets. It's more of the other way around. So yeah, I think it's been pretty quiet from what you said. Sorry, I don't have a much better answer for that.
Yeah, sorry. I think maybe I don't know, Baohui, if you have any thoughts on that, or on CFIUS and.
No, I don't have direct answer, but I think I want to make a comment related to those issues. That is decoupling versus de-risking.
Right.
They could be the same. For the U.S., I think it's the same thing, but for the Europeans, they mean different things, because Europeans, they don't, precisely because they don't want to choose sides, therefore they refuse to decouple China, but they are aware, that there are risks, in their economic dependence on China, so they say, okay, we are willing to pursue de-risking, but that is genuinely different from.
It's more of a concentration risk.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, but different from the U.S. rhetorical commitment to only de-risking but not decoupling. Because the U.S. would decouple wherever possible, but Europeans, because they don't have genuinely strategic stakes in severing economic ties with China, at best they pursue de-risking, and therefore the recent G7 meeting, most likely it's the European so-called allies that force the U.S. to accept this common term, de-risking,
Right.
because they don't want to decouple with China.
You say de-risking, I say decoupling. Let's call the whole thing off. Right. Helen, right? Yeah.
Thanks. A comment that was made earlier is if a country is too dependent on the US for security and China for economy, it's hard for them to choose. In that vein, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Australia's situation and the context of that.
Well, Australia is an interesting puzzle, right? It's a both, right? Economic dependent on China, so-called security dependent on the U.S. But international relations scholars, Australia has kind of chosen to side with the U.S. Because international relations scholars have an answer for that. They say when countries have to choose between security and economic welfare, they always choose security. Because national survival is the number one priority. Welfare, prosperity come next. So it's a natural for Australia to choose security over economic gains. But for Australia, of course, it's a strategic quagmire nonetheless. They have a lot of internal debates. They have different views. But overall speaking, the fundamental logic of international politics says if you have to choose between the two, you choose security. And therefore, the outcome we are seeing now is no surprise.
I think it's interesting if you look at how the China-Canada dispute during the Meng Wanzhou 2 Michaels case happened, and then the dispute between China and Australia over Scott Morrison, the previous Prime Minister, asking or demanding a independent inquiry onto the origin of COVID, and the dispute that arose there, particularly the trade measures. China really did treat the two countries differently. Whilst Canada did incur some trade measures, trade sanctions, that they were very quietly lifted, and indeed, even through that whole episode, Canadian-Chinese trade, bilateral trade, increased record levels, whereas Australia was much more severely affected by the measures that were taken, the sort of punitive measures. And I think that shows how China like sees Australia in a different light because it's part of the region, right?
Not only part of the region, because they, again, comes back to security reasons. Because Australia is in a position to worsen China's security context. Because it's in the region and it can ally further with the US, they can make a difference in China's security. Canada is too far away to harm China's security, has no impact, and also has no military capabilities to affect China. But Australia's especially the so-called nuclear submarine program, can harm China profoundly. Therefore, they treat the Australian case very different from the Canadian case.
I would say now, a few years later, in Ottawa, I think there's some Australia envy because with the change of government in Australia, there's a better atmosphere now between Beijing and Canberra. And it's between Ottawa and Beijing, still Mama Day, right? So it's still problematic. Other questions here? Sorry, let me collect some questions. So this gentleman here, and then the fellow at the back, and then the lady in the middle. Right? Okay, I'll collect a few questions. So,
I'm Charlie from Mingpao. I just want to ask a bit more on the strategic choice. When you talk about security or economic reliance, for a case like Japan or Korea, could we also see the matter of proximity, geographical proximity? Because, for example, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they are also security dependent on the United States, but still they have quite a lot of space to maneuver between China and US. So can we say geographic proximity is also play an important
as a factor, right? Right in the back there, and then there was the lady in the middle there. So sorry, sorry,
Okay.
the light is hard. So the gentleman at the back, and then the lady in the middle, right?
Thank you very much for this presentation, and I'm Takanori Okuda from the Japanese Trade Organization, and my question is, how do you evaluate the recent expansion of BRICS members to Middle East and other countries?
Right.
That's my question.
And then the lady in the middle here, right?
Hi, I'm Jill. I'm from Asian Global Fellow, and I have two questions which are interconnected. I was born in Georgia, which is country in Caucasus, and when we talk about the choice that small countries can choose, some countries don't have luxury to choose when they are threatened and occupied by Russia. That's one question. And I live in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, and looking at European politics, do you really think that US can decouple and Europe can de-risk? Is that real?
Okay, so fantastic. So we have geographic proximity. How is that sort of an issue? We have BRICS expansion. What are the implications, or are there any implications? And then the issue of Russia and its, as well as, sorry, de-risking in Europe, right? Is it even possible? Right. So if I might go to Ambassador.
Ambassador answered the BRICS issue.
Right, he did.
Answers the de-risking
Yes,
issue. I talk about the geography.
Thank you so much. We've got a plan. So Ambassador, you got the BRICS question.
So I think there is no question in my mind that the expansion of BRICS and the fact that 40 countries expressed interest and 20 of them formally applied means the following three things. One, there is a great desire on the part of countries to belong to a non-Western grouping, not anti-Western, and I want to underline the key difference. It's not that these countries are taking on the United States or the West, but they do want to belong to a non-Western grouping, which according to them will increase their strategic space for maneuver. in the world. So that's the first. The second, I believe, is also a desire to really see a multipolar world because the unipolar moment is over and done with. Everybody knows that. I don't believe we have a settled multipolar world. I don't think the G2 will work, despite Henry Kissinger thinking otherwise. And China toyed with the idea of G2, but it now seems to me there is so much friction between the two that G2 is out. So we are actually in the middle of a transition from a unipolar moment to a multipolar world, but the multipolar world is not settled. The contours are yet being drawn up by middle powers and others. So I think I see the BRICS as an indication of that. But if you ask me, I think the $1 million question is it going to make the BRICS more cohesive as a grouping, or is it going to become a talking shop? That's the $1 million question. And I think we will have the answer in some years. Thank you.
Thank you. Chi-Jia, on de-risking issues, Europe and
Yeah, I don't think that de-risking and decoupling is going to be successful. I think that there will be like contours around where companies will look to invest, but completely like, you know, being able to say, okay, we are completely de-risked from China. I don't think that's likely. I do think that over particularly over the COVID years, as supply chains were impacted, we saw a lot of reshoring or nearshoring to the U.S. And as a natural part of that, I think a lot of U.S. companies did move operations either back to the U.S. or to Mexico, which was a really big winner. So not just the ASEAN countries won from these like nearshoring or diversification strategies that companies are looking at, but also Mexico, just because of getting things across the Pacific Ocean took a lot more time, right? So companies that had multi-country supply chains just looked a lot closer. So I think that it's not so easy, but I do think that there are challenges for companies, and that companies need to be aware of. So in terms of de-risking, like with Biden's executive order, I don't think it's that far off that Japan implements something similar in terms of outbound investments for Japanese companies, investing into Chinese, and not just that. I think the EO mentions Hong Kong and Macau as well.
right.
So it's restricting investments into China, Hong Kong, and Macau. So I could see Japan doing something similar, especially after this successful trilateral meeting at Camp David, where the three countries, Korea, Japan, and the U.S., committed to having annual meetings in a whole variety of things. And then they're also going to be much more, I think, in step on supply chain security. So yeah, I don't think it's entirely possible, but I think it'll be that there will be attempts.
Thank you. Baohui, you have the last word.
Maybe I just first add a little bit to Chi-Jia's answer to that question, because the lady specifically asked whether European countries can decouple. And here, I think there's an interesting difference between European countries and the US. American companies, often they have to decouple because the government orders them to do so.
Right.
Because US has a, I would say, national security state, which is inherited from the Cold War, and therefore has a relatively strong state, has strong state autonomy vis-a-vis the society. So it can make unthinkable decisions. A few years ago, they just prohibit private companies from doing business with China in certain sectors. And those companies can do nothing to challenge that. But European countries, none of them has that kind of national security state. None of them has the state capacity to enforce those decisions. So even if, say, German government their foreign ministry, right? People say drafted a secret document saying we should prepare for de-risking. Does German government have the power, to affect the private sectors? They don't have the channels, so they can do little actually, It's purely a matter of choice of those companies. If they don't see risk, they are not going to leave China. Those companies are leaving China. Many of them, they are ordered by the U.S. government to leave China. If not, they are penalized by law. They can go to prison for that. So these are different things. So European decoupling, I don't think it's going to happen.
And I think that's
on that
very
scale.
important to understand the
exactly.
difference.
State difference,
Absolutely.
basically. Yeah,
Right.
affect international outcomes. The last question is
geographic proximity.
Geographic proximity.
Yes.
But Saudi Arabia and UAE, they are improving relations with China, maybe to the ear of the Washington, these other allies. It may not be due to geography. It's actually due to their peculiar strength. They are core American allies in a very important region. U.S. are dependent on them. It's not the dependency is the other way around. Oil, the need to deter, contain Iran. Saudis have a free hand to do anything. Without punitive action from the, for example, they could launch a war for many years in Yemen, right? Washington doesn't like it, but can do nothing to stop it. So Saudis have a lot of strategic autonomy because of peculiar strength.
Thank you very much. I don't see any of my former students in the room. If I did, they would certainly be the ones to know that I'm just bad at time management. But we've reached the end, and I appreciate your forbearance in our going way ahead of time, over time. And I thank Chi-Jia, Baohui, Ambassador Kumar for your engagement and your insight. And I thank you all for your questions. I just, as a last word, just go back to the idea that perhaps the most important meeting this year might not be the G20 or even the Xi-Biden meetings that we will see in Delhi and in November at APEC or whatever, but maybe we should all be looking and hoping that the COP meeting at the end of the year will be more important, because frankly that's really the existential, it'll take up issues of real existential importance, and we should be all focused maybe more on that than on the geopolitics that we see play out every day. So thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone for coming, and please join us for drinks in the Li Kuo Wei room. Thanks.